Chinese President Xi Jinping met with visiting European Council President Charles Michel Thursday morning in Beijing. This is the first time an official meeting took place between the leaders of China and the EU institutions after the 20th National Congress of the Communist Party of China. Prior to the visit, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson said China attaches great importance to its relations with the EU and hopes to strengthen strategic communication and build consensus with the European side, while the European Council called the visit a timely opportunity to engage. So why is this a timely opportunity to engage? What to expect for China-EU relations in the near future and what's at stake? I'm pleased to be joined from Rome by Michele, former Undersecretary of State at the Italian Ministry of Economic Development. Also from Rome, Daniel Gross, Director of the Center for European Policy Studies, and from Beijing, Cui Hongjian, Director of the Department of European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Mr. Cui, let me go to you first. Now, this is the first visit to China by a European Council president since 2018, and it comes at China's invitation. What do you know is on the agenda of both sides, especially on the European side? What do you know that has been discussed in the meeting?
First of all, I would like to emphasize the significance of the visit by President Michel to China. Even as we know, in the past more than 2 years, even both sides had some communication online, but it's the first time, as we know, the face-to-face communication. So it's so important for both sides to resolve some problem or challenges on both sides. Firstly, for example, how about the mutual perception issue? As we know, in the past 2 or 3 years, certainly there are more and more negative, perceptions from a European side on China, and also at the same time, how could both two sides to promote the cooperation? Of course, on the basis of stabilizing the relations. The third is, yes, because of Ukrainian crisis, because of gaming between China and the United States, there are a lot of negative impact on China-EU relations. So how could China and the EU to, have some more resilience to deal with any kind of impact from other big powers relations? I think that would be a very, very important issue. Of course, recently we find out the more and more communication between China and the European countries, not only the Chancellor Scholz's visit to China, and also President Xi's meeting with some European countries' leader during the G20 summit. So I think, yes, this visit by President Michel will be a continue of this, go back to normal track for China-EU relations.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Gross, how high is your expectation for the impact of this meeting from the position that Mr. Michel holds within the European institutions, but also against the backdrop, as Mr. Cui just mentioned, the series of meetings that have been taking place over the past year, actually, between the high-level leaders of China and the Europeans?
As Professor Cui just said, maintaining a dialogue, maintaining lines of communications is very important, especially when the two sides have differing opinions on major issues. And that's the case right now. And it's very useful to have the head of the European Council in Beijing, not because he can take big decisions on trade issue and economic issues, but he can transmit, in a certain sense, what many European heads of state think, what is their position towards China. Your President Xi Jinping had the occasion to meet the leaders of the largest European countries. But in Europe, the smaller countries also count, and there are many of them. And in a sense, Charles Michel will also represent their views. And I think he will bring back also to them and to the wider European audience what is the Chinese reaction to European concerns. And that concerns, of course, now mainly or primarily the position of China towards the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where Europe, to some extent, is happy that China does not really materially help Russia, but is asking itself what is the broader political position which China will be taking, where is it leaning? And I think these are the atmospheric issues which in the long run are important because they determine a policy in more concrete issues which will come up later, namely economic and trade relations.
Michele, there's big trade going on between the two sides. And in 2021, last year, actually, China was Europe's third largest partner for exports and biggest partner for imports. So both imports and exports reached 10-year high last year. Some people are calling Europe's trade with China over-reliance that needs to be corrected. What is your view?
We need to understand what we mean by reliance. Indeed, China is a big trading partner for Europe, but China is not, with all due respect, Panama. So China will always be a relevant market for almost all countries in the world. If it's not the number one, it will be number two, number three. So the reliance from China could be a challenge, but it is a fact that countries need to face. Now, we always, for example, during the visit of Chancellor Scholz to China, some people also criticized Germany for relying too much on China, exporting 130, 150 billion. Now, there's two ways to reduce the reliance. Either you do less business with China, which I don't think is a good idea, or you increase the business with others so that the relative importance of China diminishes. So the problem that China is a big player in the economies of European countries is because European countries do not succeed in expanding the market beyond the European Union and the United States. So the traditional, let's say, Western countries where we have affinity of culture and trade for many centuries. So it is, of course, not a good idea to say, oh, I rely too much on China, so I kill my own business in China, so China from 50% becomes 20% of my business, because that just kills your overall business. So the way to, with this fact in mind, the way to limit the external shock risk is to know and understand more about this Chinese market and try to turn these numbers, this 470 billion of import and export, 230, into what can European countries do if some problem arises. So what can we do if container costs go up? What happens if we have a shortage of supply in the semiconductor value chain? So these are the questions that we need to address, not to say, oh, we don't buy from China, because we don't have anyone else to buy from. And this is exactly the same thing that we're doing with Russia. We rely on Russia on gas, but the reason why we rely a lot on Russia is because we have no alternative suppliers.
Why has there been this talk of over-reliance, especially in the media, in many media, calling for, this to be corrected, that they don't repeat the mistake with Russia, and they're also calling for correcting the so-called trade imbalance, meaning China sells more than China buys. I mean, we had this problem. We had this man-made problem with the United States when the United States when former U.S. President Donald Trump decided that trade deficit was a bad thing, was a failure, and they tried to correct that. And in the end, they found out, there is a lesson to be learned. Mr. Gross, do you think there is something wrong with the way of seeing trade or numbers in trade, giving it extra political, connotations here?
Yeah, there's a disconnect between the political discourse and actually what's happening to the economy on the ground. Actually, at the political level, I would say in Europe, the bilateral trade balance is not so important because overall, Europe has quite a favorable balance of trade. And we know that we run a deficit with China, a deficit with some other countries, but we run very large surpluses, for example, with the United States. And therefore, overall trade for Europe is quite balanced. And Europe is quite strong in exporting manufacturing stuff, which China needs and China produces. So on the economy, I would say very little practical difficulties. But the geopoliticians who sit in their armchairs and say, okay, here is a big customer and client, and what happens if we have a political problem with them? Then we have an economic problem, but that's quite clear. But as I said earlier, de facto, all this talk about disengaging is really just talk at the political level, because the economic incentives are and remain to trade.
One good thing that came out of this meeting between President Xi and Mr. Michel of the European Council, as according to the Chinese readout, is that both sides decide, or Mr. Michel said the European side is willing to push together with the Chinese side the process of the bilateral investment treaty that was kind of shelved. So this is a positive development. And however, on the other hand, you mentioned, the disconnect between the economic talks and the political process. But there is also the disconnect between different member states within the European Union. In October, for instance, 27 EU members discussed for 3 hours to have a China stance, but they failed. They struggled to come up with a cohesive stance on China. What is preventing them from finding the most practical and suitable approach for Europe to deal with China? Michele.
We are 27 member states, each of us with different economic interests with respect to China. Some rely a lot, like Germany, some sell certain goods, some sell certain others. The European Union does a trade policy, so tariffs, quota, a little bit on the investment, which is a borderline responsibility between member states and the European Union, but really does not do, in a way, a foreign policy in the traditional sense. And so the reason why countries do not want to agree on a framework is because it binds them to a EU-led white paper or recommendation that then they cannot maybe move out or have the flexibility to adjust. For example, the European Union claims China is a strategic rival. As a former member of Italian government, I would never say something like this. My economy relies on export. 1/3 of our GDP comes from export. We would never call our customer a strategic rival.
Many thanks to Michele Giracci, Daniel Gross joining us from Rome, Italy, and Cui Hongjian joining us from Beijing. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, we'll look into Washington's microchipped crusade on China and its potential repercussions. Stay with us.